Hello, class. Dr. Bauer's Office Hours here, and today we're going to be discussing two older theological ideas, Pantheism and the Neoplatonic Doctrine of Emanations. Oh. As always, here's some study guide questions to help you think about this. What is Pantheism? Why might Pantheism be a problem? Which two arguments suggest that theism entails pantheism? What is the Neoplatonic Doctrine of Emanations? What is Proclus's argument for the Neoplatonic Doctrine of Emanation? In which two ways does the Neoplatonic Doctrine of Emanations differ from Judeo-Christian theology? Let's get started. Pantheism comes from pan, meaning all, and theos, meaning God, is the thesis that God is all that there is. Or to put it another way, God is the only thing that exists. You could phrase it also as this thesis, that there does not exist anything which is not God. In other words, pantheism is the thesis that the only thing that there is, the only real thing at all, is God. Don't confuse this with a related thesis called panentheism, which says that God inheres in all things, or that God is present in all things. Sometimes this is phrased as the thesis that the world is God's body. That's not the same thing as pantheism, or at least the version of pantheism that we'll be discussing. Because the version of pantheism that we'll be discussing is actually a problem. It's a problem for two reasons. First, it does not seem to be true that God is all that there is. Look around you. Pick three things. I'm sure all three of them have a very high chance of not being God, right? Given the ease with which we can list things that are numerically distinct from God, that is, things that are not the same as God, it's very hard to maintain the thesis that God is the only thing that exists. I mean, think about it. It's hard enough trying to prove that God exists at all. Imagine trying to prove that God is the only thing that exists. So this variety of pantheism we're considering, it does not seem to be obviously true. It's certainly not confirmed by ordinary experience, and indeed, ordinary experience seems to tell against it. And yet, and here's why it's really a problem, theism, as is often understood, threatens to entail this strong version of pantheism. It seems like if you consider the version of theism that most people think about and believe if they're theists, if theism is true at all, then this version of pantheism would have to be true too. And since this version of pantheism isn't true, or doesn't seem to be true, that's a problem for theism. So pantheism might be a problem because it looks false, and also theism seems to entail it. But why? Why would theism entail pantheism? There are two reasons. They are both based in the idea that God is absolutely perfect. One of these arguments proceeds by saying, since God is perfect, God must be self-sufficient. The other argument proceeds by saying, since God is perfect, God must be unlimited. And then each of these separate considerations, being self-sufficient and being unlimited, lead to pantheism. Let's consider them one at a time. First, the idea that since God is perfect, God must be self-sufficient. To be self-sufficient is to not want or need anything. And if you imagine God to be a perfect being, that should make sense. If God needed food, or if God needed to sleep, or if God needed a friend, and likewise with wanting, that would seem to be some kind of deficiency in God, that God was not enough, incomplete, lacking in some way. A perfect, all-powerful being, it seems, should not want anything either. The idea of a perfect being wanting something or needing it seems odd. And so, goes the argument, there should be no other beings. If God alone exists, and God does not want anything else, and God does not need anything else, then pantheism should be true. God should not have created anything. That's one argument which says that theism entails pantheism. It's that the perfection of God requires a self-sufficiency that would render the rest of the universe redundant. There's no need for God to create a universe. The other argument for thinking that theism leads to pantheism lies in the idea that God is unlimited. It goes like this. If God is unlimited, there can be no other beings. God is indeed unlimited, so there can be no other beings. Pantheism is true. Now, why think that God's being unlimited means that there can be no other beings? Think of it this way. We're used to thinking about how unacceptable it is for there to be a limit on God's power, or for there to be a limit on God's knowledge. But what about a limit on God's identity? A being which is something else is a being which God is not. It's a limit on what God is. It's a limit on God's identity. If God were truly unlimited in all respects, including in the respect of identity, there should be no other thing. Thus, we have this conception of being unlimited, which involves not being distinct from anything else. And to the extent that you find it intuitive that God should be unlimited, that is an extent to which theism threatens to entail pantheism for you. Now, because pantheism is very easy to argue against, remember, just take any three things around you and ask whether any of them are God, these arguments can be used and have been used against theism. In an argument called A Disproof of the Existence of God, Ian Weeks uses this unlimited consideration to argue that there is no God, since if there were one, it would have to be unlimited in a way that entails pantheism, specifically the strong version of pantheism that we can falsify from experience. So we have this problem. If God exists, why should there be anything else? How could there be anything else? Ancient philosophers used to worry about this a lot. Far from finding a problem in proving the existence of a god, many ancient philosophers found a problem in proving the existence of anything else. Enter the Neoplatonic Doctrine of Emanations. This idea, defended by followers of Plato and allegedly found in the pages of Plato's more metaphysical works, such as the Speech of Diotima in the Symposium, books 5 through 7 of the Republic, the Parmenides, and others, goes like this. A truly divine principle, by its very nature, must produce something else of lesser power, which in turn does the same, and so on. And through this production, which is eternal, a chain of being is suspended from divinity. The idea is that a god, a divine principle, a divine being, is the sort of entity that cannot help but create. It must, by its very nature, produce. And, due to the laws of metaphysics, that production cannot but be something which is lesser. And the product of the divine principle, in turn, must do the same. Also produce something, which in turn produces something, which in turn produces something. And at each stage, there is a degree of diminishment in power and excellence. And so you end up with the classic Platonic metaphysics, where reality is divided into hierarchically organized layers, with abstract, simple, perfect things at the hierarchy's apex, and complex, material, complicated things at the bottom, and the further up you go, the better things are, and at each stage in the hierarchy, it is that thing's purpose to achieve or to become closer to whatever is further up in those stages. The metaphysical blueprints for all this are laid in the sun, line, and cave analogies in the central portion of Plato's Republic, and it is connected to the doctrine of emanations in that way. We can see that if the doctrine of emanations is correct, that would be an answer to the puzzle of why not pantheism. It would be a theoretical explanation which accounted for the perfection of divinity while also explaining the world's existence in light of it. So let's consider an argument for the Neoplatonic doctrine of emanations. Because many Neoplatonic doctrines are the result of careful exegetical scholarship on Plato and on Aristotle, not all of them are succinctly stated or argued for. However, the Athenian Neoplatonic philosopher Proclus the Successor, who according to reputation was not only a brilliant philosopher but a powerful sorcerer, presented something like an argument in his work The Elements of Theology. Let's take a look at it. Proposition 7. Every productive cause is superior to that which it produces. For if the productive cause is not superior, it must be either inferior or equal. Let us first suppose it equal. Now either the product has itself power to produce a further principle, or it is altogether sterile. But if it be supposed sterile, it is thereby proved inferior to its producer. The impotent is not equal to the fecund, in which is the power of creation. And if it be productive, the further product will again be either equal to its cause or unequal. But if it be equal, and if this be true universally, then the producer generates a consequent equal to itself, then all beings will be equal to another, and no one better than another. And if it be not equal, neither was the former product equal to the former producer. For equal powers create equals. But if a cause, not being equal to its consequent, were yet equal to its own power, we should have here equal powers creating unequals. Therefore, it is impossible the product should be equal to the producer. Again, it is impossible the producer should ever be inferior. For as it gives the product existence, it must also furnish the power proper for that existence. But if it is itself productive of all that power which is in it consequent, it is able to create a like character in itself, that is, to increase its own power. The means to this cannot be lacking, since it has force sufficient to create, nor can the will be lacking, since by nature all things have appetition of their good. Therefore, were it able to fashion another thing more perfect than itself, it would make itself perfect before its consequent. Since then, the product is neither equal to the producer nor superior to it, the producer is necessarily superior to the product. So what's going on is an argument by elimination. The conclusion of the argument is that a divine principle must produce something that is less excellent than it, which in turn must produce something that is less excellent than it, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on, until you finally produce the material world. Wow, is the material world worst? Are we the worst? This argument from elimination focuses on the very first productive step and asks whether the thing that is produced by a divine principle would itself make something better than it, worse than it, or equal to it. And by ruling out that the product of a divine principle would make something equal to it or make something better than it, we arrive at the conclusion that a product of the divine principle must make something worse than it, and so on for its products. There's almost an argument from mathematical induction in here. So let's formalize this argument and maybe clean it up a bit for modern readers. First, the productive is superior to the unproductive. Second, if the productive is superior to the unproductive, a perfect divine principle, D, must produce something. 3. So D must produce something. Call that thing X. 4. Either D and X are equals, or X is superior to D, or else D is superior to X. 5. If D and X are equals, then they will be equal in production, in which case all beings will be equal to one another. So it will produce something that's equal to itself, that will produce something equal, that will produce something equal, that will produce something equal. This would generate a cosmology in which there are an infinite number of beings that are all on an equal theological plane. Pretty cool, but not our world. Let's continue. but not all beings are equal to one another. 7. So, D and X are not equals. 8. So, X is superior to D, or D is superior to X. 9. If X is superior to D, then D lacks the power that it confers onto X. This is the idea that if something produces another being, it must furnish that being with power from itself. Like a transference of energy principle or something. 10th, it is absurd that D lack power which it confers onto X. 11th, so X is not superior to D. 12th, that leaves us only one option left. D is superior to X. And so we get the result that what the divine principle produces must be of lesser excellence, and its products must be of lesser excellence, and its products must be of lesser excellence, and so on. A Christian interpretation of Proclus can be found in the work of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who replaced the Neoplatonic Doctrine of Emanations with layers of forms and perfections and Olympian gods, with a hierarchy of angels, of seraphs and cherubs, and so on. If you've ever been interested in celestial hierarchies, or perhaps in demonic hierarchies, it has its roots in this Neoplatonic doctrine, which in turn, among other things, is a philosophical answer to the puzzle of why not pantheism. This does not prove every little thing that the Neoplatonists have to say about the Doctrine of Emanations, but it provides something like a skeletal framework for it and a bare-bones argument for it. So we have this idea that a divine being overflows with power and goodness. It cannot help but produce something, and that thing possesses power and excellence that comes from its source, but not quite as much. But because of its power and excellence that it inherited, it too produces a thing, which produces a thing, which produces a thing. Notice, however, divine principles, gods, are eternal. A god has no beginning or end. And this cosmic process of production, this emanation, does not take time to occur. I mean, why would it take time? Like it takes time for the archangel seraphs to make cherubs, like working on it or something? That's silly. That's like saying it takes time for 1 + 1 to equal 2. Maybe it takes time for us to add it up, but the state of affairs of 1 + 1 adding up to 2 is not some event that takes time to unfold. As if there were some period in history in which 1 + 1 did not yet equal 2, but we're still adding up to that. No, nonsense. But look, if the divine principle necessarily produces things, and it takes no time to do so, and it has existed eternally, these together imply the eternity of the cosmos. That the material world has always existed, that there was no creation and shall be no end. Not, at least, unless there is an end to the divine. This famously runs up against the Judeo-Christian idea that the cosmos was created, and there was a time at which there was a divine principle, and yet there was no material cosmos. In late antiquity, there were fierce debates over the eternity of the world. Proclus, in fact, was a participant in them, arguing for the world's eternity. He got to claim Plato and Aristotle on his side. Although things that Plato said about the demiurge and the Timaeus made this a little tricky. Now, the second way that the Neoplatonic Doctrine of Emanations differs from Judeo-Christian notions is in the impersonality of the divine principle. It's right there in the name, divine principle. I didn't say divine person, I said principle, like a number or an axiom. And indeed, that is how Neoplatonists thought of God. They thought of God as more like a principle from which the universe was derived, rather than an artisan that constructed the universe as an artifact. These, in addition to other considerations, may be why the Neoplatonic doctrine of emanations fell out of favor. It may also be due to no one worrying about pantheism being true. If emanations were a solution to that puzzle, and no one worries about the puzzle, why think about emanations? But that's it for our discussion of pantheism and emanations. Tell me, what do you think about them? As always, thanks for watching. Goodbye.